The moment she dialed 911, I knew this was going to get interesting. Not because I was worried, but because the woman standing in my driveway had absolutely no idea who she was messing with. It started on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind of suburban morning where the loudest sound is usually lawnmowers and distant barking dogs. I was standing beside my truck, pumping diesel from the fuel tank I keep in my garage workshop. The pump hummed steadily while the smell of diesel mixed with fresh-cut grass drifting across the street. Just another normal day. Then I heard the clicking. Sharp, aggressive footsteps on pavement. The kind that sound expensive and angry at the same time. I didn't even need to look up to know who it was. Brenda Ashworth, the president of our neighborhood HOA, and the closest thing Willowbrook Estates had to a self-appointed dictator. Her Range Rover rolled into my driveway like she owned the place. The thing gleamed in the sunlight like it had just been polished by a team of interns. Brenda climbed out wearing oversized sunglasses and a tight smile that already told me this conversation wasn't going to be friendly. She marched straight up to my fuel pump, looked at the nozzle in my hand, then back at me. "Good," she said. "You're already pumping. No breathing, no small talk, just entitlement." Then she tossed me her car keys like we were old buddies at a gas station. "Fill up my Range Rover while you're at it." I stared at the keys in my hand for a second, waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one. "You want me to what?" I asked. Her smile tightened. "Fill it up," she repeated slowly, like I was a slow child. As HOA president, I shouldn't have to pay when residents have resources like this available. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so ridiculous my brain needed a second to process it. "You're serious?" I said. Brenda crossed her arms. Completely. The diesel pump clicked off behind me with a dull metallic thunk. I hung the nozzle back on the pump and looked her straight in the eye. No. Just one word, but apparently that word was illegal in Brenda's universe. Her face froze. Then it twisted into the kind of expression people make when a waiter refuses their expired coupon. "I'm sorry," she said. I said no, I repeated calmly. "It's my fuel, my pump, my property. If you want gas, there's a station 2 blocks down." For a moment, she just stared at me, then something inside her snapped. "You were refusing a direct request from the HOA president." "It wasn't a request," I said. "It was a demand." That's when she pulled out her phone. Fast. Like she'd been waiting for this moment. She tapped 3 numbers and raised the phone to her ear while staring at me like I'd just committed a felony. "Yes," she said loudly into the phone. "I need police assistance immediately." I leaned against my truck and folded my arms. This was getting good. "There's a hostile man threatening me," she continued dramatically. "He's refusing to cooperate and acting aggressive. Aggressive." I hadn't even raised my voice. But Brenda wasn't done. "He's operating some kind of illegal fuel station out of his garage," she added. "I believe it's dangerous. That one almost made me choke." "Illegal fuel station?" "Right." The dispatcher must have asked for details because Brenda immediately started pointing at me like the camera crew from a crime documentary was already filming. "Yes," she said. "He's right here. Tall guy. Standing next to a large fuel tank." Then she smiled. Not a normal smile. The kind of smug smile someone wears when they think they've already won. "You better stay right there," she told me after hanging up. "The police will handle this." I nodded slowly. "Oh, I'm sure they will." What Brenda Ashworth didn't know, what she never bothered to check, was that the officers she had just called worked for me. Because my name is Marcus Kellerman, and I'm the police chief of this city. But somehow, this was only the beginning of the craziest neighborhood war Willowbrook Estates had ever seen. Before I tell you how Brenda's 911 call turned into the worst mistake of her life, you should probably understand who I actually am. Because from her point of view, I was just some quiet middle-aged guy with a fuel pump in his garage. And that misunderstanding? It's exactly what made the entire situation spiral completely out of control. You see, people in Willowbrook Estates didn't know much about me. That was intentional. When I moved into the neighborhood 6 months earlier, I didn't exactly show up waving a badge or announcing my resume at the local barbecue. I kept things simple. Just Marcus, the new guy with the old pickup truck, the guy who spent weekends in his garage restoring classic vehicles, the guy who nodded politely when neighbors walked their dogs past my driveway. To most people, I probably looked like a retired mechanic or a hobbyist who liked greasy engines and loud tools. And honestly, I was perfectly happy letting them think that, because after the year I'd had, quiet anonymity was exactly what I needed. I'm 52 years old. Most of my adult life has been spent in jobs where quiet neighborhoods and peaceful mornings didn't exist. My career started in the military logistics division. 20 years of coordinating supply chains across 3 continents, moving fuel, vehicles, medical equipment, anything troops needed to survive in places where survival was never guaranteed. You learn a lot in that kind of job. How to stay calm under pressure, how to solve problems quickly, and most importantly, how to recognize when someone is about to make a very big mistake. But the military wasn't the hardest part of my life, not even close. That came later. My wife Sarah was diagnosed with cancer 3 years ago. If you have ever watched someone you love fight that battle, then you already know there's no way to describe it properly. Hospitals become your second home. Time starts moving in strange ways. Weeks fly by, but every moment inside those hospital rooms feels like it lasts forever. For 2 years, we fought it together. Chemotherapy, surgeries, experimental treatments that cost more than my first house. Through all of it, Sarah kept telling me the same thing. Marcus, you'd say, smiling even when she barely had the strength to sit up. When this is over, we're moving somewhere quiet. She wanted trees, peace, a place where the loudest sound in the morning was birds instead of traffic. Willowbrook Estates looked exactly like that kind of place. Tree-lined streets, 200 houses, kids riding bicycles on sidewalks, the kind of neighborhood that looks like it belongs on a postcard. Sarah passed away last spring, and after the funeral, I couldn't stay in our old house anymore. Every room held memories that were too heavy to carry around every day. So I sold it, packed what I needed into a moving truck, and started over here in Willowbrook. The house I bought came with something unexpected. In the back of the property sat a detached garage workshop. Inside it was a professionally installed diesel storage tank and pump system that the previous owner, a retired farmer, had used for agricultural equipment. The setup was impressive. Industrial-grade pump, fire safety system, proper permits already filed with the county. After a few upgrades and inspections, the entire system was perfectly legal for personal use. For me, it became something else entirely. Therapy. Restoring old trucks gave my hands something to do while my mind slowly learned how to exist without Sarah. The smell of diesel fuel and motor oil, the rhythmic clink of tools on metal, the quiet satisfaction of bringing an old engine back to life. Those things helped more than any counselor ever could. And occasionally, during storms or power outages, that fuel pump helped my neighbors too. When the electricity went out last winter, 3 houses on our street needed fuel for their generators. An elderly couple down the block had medical equipment that couldn't lose power for long, so I filled their gas cans and sent them home. No charge, just neighbor helping neighbor. Most people in Willowbrook appreciated that. Most people, but Brenda Ashworth wasn't most people. To her, the fuel pump wasn't a helpful resource. It was an opportunity. A resource she believed she was entitled to control. And standing there in my driveway that morning, watching her smug expression after she called the police, I realized something very important. Brenda Ashworth had no idea who she was dealing with. She thought she'd just picked a fight with a quiet mechanic. Instead, she had just declared war on the chief of police. And if there's one thing 20 years in military logistics taught me, it's that wars are won long before the first shot is fired. And Brenda had already made her first critical mistake. Have you ever met someone so entitled? They think the law only applies to everyone else. Because that's exactly what happened the moment this HOA Karen crossed her arms, pulled out her phone, and loudly declared, "Fine, if you won't cooperate, I'm calling the police." And I swear the irony of that moment was almost too good to be true. But she had absolutely no idea who she was threatening. The afternoon sun hung low over the gas station canopy, the kind of QEAAT, suburban afternoon where nothing unusual ever happens. Cars came and went, the faint smell of gasoline drifted through the air, and I was just finishing up fueling my car before heading home. Then Karen showed up. She had already made a scene demanding free gas, insisting that the HOA had some kind of authority over the station. Which, of course, it didn't. When the clerk refused her, she turned to me, assuming I was just another customer she could bully. "Excuse me," she snapped earlier. "You look like you work here. I need gas on pump 3. When I told her I didn't work there and that she needed to pay like everyone else, that's when the attitude started escalating. And now, here we were. She stood beside her oversized SUV, glaring at me like I had personally ruined her day. "You are being extremely uncooperative," she said loudly enough for half the station to hear. I shrugged calmly. "Ma'am, I don't work here. And even if I did, nobody gets free gas." That was the moment her face turned red. Not embarrassment, not realization. Pure, offended entitlement. "You clearly don't understand who I am," she said, placing one hand on her hip. That sentence alone was enough to make the gas station clerk quietly retreat behind the counter. Because if you've ever dealt with someone like this, you already know what's coming next. "I'm the president of the HOA in this neighborhood," she continued proudly, "which means businesses around here cooperate with us." I blinked slowly, HOA president, at a gas station, demanding free fuel. My brain genuinely tried to process the logic and failed. "I'm pretty sure that's not how that works," I said. That was apparently the wrong answer. Her eyes narrowed instantly. "Oh, really?" Then came the moment that turned this entire situation from annoying to hilarious. Karen pulled her phone out of her purse, and Dee started dialing. "You know what?" she said loudly. "I'm done arguing. I'm calling the police." A couple people nearby stopped pumping gas and glanced over. The clerk peeked nervously from behind the register, and I just stood there. Because the situation had just taken a very interesting turn. Karen paced slightly while the phone rang, glaring at me the entire time like she'd just caught a criminal in the act. "You'll see," she muttered. "They'll sort you out real quick." Now, normally when someone threatens to call the police, people panic. They get nervous, they start explaining themselves. But not me. I simply leaned against my car and waited, which seemed to confuse her. "You're awfully calm for someone about to be arrested," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "Arrested for what exactly?" "For harassment and refusing service," she snapped. The logic still made no sense, but she seemed completely convinced. Then the call connected. "Yes, hello?" Karen said loudly into the phone. "I'd like to report harassment at the gas station on Maple Avenue." She paused dramatically, clearly enjoying the attention she was getting. "There's a man here refusing to cooperate and causing problems. I believe he works here and he's denying service." Several people nearby exchanged confused looks. The clerk behind the counter actually whispered, "He doesn't work here," to another customer. But Karen was fully committed now. "Yes," she continued into the phone. "I'd like an officer sent immediately." She hung up and looked at me with a smug smile. "There," she said, "let's see how confident you are when the police arrive." A small crowd had started forming around the pumps now. Nothing attracts attention faster than a public argument. I checked my watch casually. "Well," I said, "they should be here soon." Karen smirked. "Oh, they will be." And that's when she made one final mistake. She pointed directly at me and said loudly, "You're going to regret not listening to me." I couldn't help it. I actually chuckled. Because in about 5 minutes, Karen was going to realize something that would completely flip this entire situation upside down. She had just called the police on the wrong person. And when those patrol cars pulled into the station, her day was about to get a whole lot worse. You know that moment when someone is so confident they're right, so certain they're about to win, and then reality hits them like a truck. Because that's exactly what happened when the police cars finally pulled into the gas station, and Karen was smiling. The gas station had grown unusually quiet. A few minutes earlier, people had been fueling their cars, chatting, scrolling their phones. But now, almost everyone was watching. Karen had turned the entire place into a spectacle. She stood near pump 3, arms crossed, looking like a self-appointed neighborhood sheriff. Every few seconds she glanced down the road, clearly waiting for the police to arrive. And every time she looked at me, she smirked. "You're going to wish you had just given me the gas," she said smugly. I leaned against my car, completely relaxed. The clerk inside the station looked nervous, probably worried the whole situation would somehow end badly for the store. Karen, meanwhile, seemed thrilled, because in her mind, she had already won. Then we all heard it, the distant sound of a siren. A few heads turned. Karen's smile widened instantly. "Ah," she said loudly, "perfect timing." Within seconds, a patrol car turned into the gas station lot, then another. 2 officers stepped out. Karen straightened up immediately, like she had just summoned reinforcements. She raised her hand dramatically and waved them over. "Officers, over here." The 2 officers walked toward us calmly, scanning the situation like trained professionals do. One of them glanced briefly at me, then looked back at Karen. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" the officer asked. Karen wasted no time. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," she said, pointing directly at me. "This man is harassing people and refusing service. He works here and won't let me get gas. He's been incredibly rude and aggressive." A few customers nearby quietly shook their heads. Even the clerk inside the store looked like he wanted to correct her story, but stayed silent. The officer turned toward me. Now normally this is where things get tense, but instead, the officer's expression suddenly shifted. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Then he smiled. Chief Karen froze. Just for a second. She blinked rapidly. "Wait, what?" The officer straightened up slightly and nodded respectfully. "Good afternoon, Chief." The second officer did the same. "Didn't realize you were out here today, sir." Suddenly, the entire gas station went silent. Karen's confident posture evaporated instantly. Her head snapped toward me. "What did he just call you?" I pushed myself off my car and gave the officers a small nod. "Afternoon, guys." Then I turned back to Karen, and that's when the realization finally hit her. Her face went pale. "Chief," she repeated quietly. The officer looked confused. "Yes, ma'am, that's the police chief." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. The smug confidence she'd been carrying for the past 10 minutes completely disappeared. Instead, she looked like someone who had just realized they had made a very big mistake. The officer turned to me again. "Everything all right here, Chief?" I shrugged casually. "Well, apparently I'm guilty of refusing to give out free gas." The second officer raised an eyebrow. "Free gas?" Karen suddenly tried to recover. "That's not what I meant," she said quickly. "There's been a misunderstanding, but it was too late." The first officer looked back at her. "Ma'am, you reported harassment." Karen started stumbling over her words. "Well, I thought he worked here, and..." The gas station clerk finally stepped outside. "Officers, he doesn't work here," the clerk said nervously. "She demanded free gas, then got mad when we said no." Now the officers looked even more confused. Karen's face turned bright red. "I'm the president of the HOA," she said desperately. "Businesses in this area usually cooperate with us." One of the officers blinked slowly. "Ma'am, HOA rules don't apply to gas stations." A couple people nearby laughed quietly. Karen looked around, suddenly realizing she had an audience. Every single person at the station was watching, and now the story she had told the police was completely falling apart. She turned back to me with a forced smile. "Maybe we can just forget this whole thing." I crossed my arms. "Well, you did call the police." The first officer nodded slightly. "Yes, ma'am, and making a false report is something we take seriously." Karen looked like she might pass out. Her plan to intimidate me had just backfired in the worst possible way, and the situation she thought would humiliate me had just turned into a nightmare for her instead. You know that moment when someone realizes they've messed up so badly that there's no way out. Their confidence disappears. Their voice starts shaking, and suddenly the person who is yelling the loudest is begging the quietest. Because that's exactly what happened to Karen. The moment she realized the man she had called the police on was the police chief. And what happened next? Let's just say things got very uncomfortable for her. For a few seconds, Karen just stood there, frozen. Her eyes moved between me and the two officers, like she was trying to convince herself she had heard wrong. "Chief," she repeated again, almost whispering. Neither officer laughed. Neither officer looked amused. They were simply waiting, because now the situation had completely flipped. A few minutes earlier, Karen had been loud, confident, and demanding. Now she looked like someone who had accidentally walked into the wrong courtroom. She quickly forced a nervous smile. "Oh, well, I didn't know that," she said awkwardly. The first officer crossed his arms slightly. "Yes, ma'am. That's why we greeted him." Karen nodded rapidly. Right. Of course." Then she tried something that people like her always try when things go wrong. She tried to rewrite the story. "Well," she said quickly, "there's obviously just been a misunderstanding." The gas station clerk behind us raised his eyebrows. The officer looked back at Karen. "A misunderstanding?" he asked. Karen nodded eagerly. "Yes, that's all it is." "I thought he worked here, and he was being rude, and—" "Ma'am," the clerk interrupted gently, "you demanded free gas." Karen shot him a glare sharp enough to cut glass, but the damage had already been done. The second officer looked confused. "Free gas." Karen waved her hands quickly. No, that's not what I meant. No, that's not what I meant. I was just asking about a community partnership discount for HOA members." The customers nearby started quietly chuckling, because everyone standing there had heard exactly what she said earlier. One guy leaned against his truck and whispered to his friend, "That's not what she said 5 minutes ago." Karen's smile started slipping again. She turned back to me with a forced laugh. "Maybe we can just move past all this." I tilted my head slightly. "Well, you did call the police and accuse me of harassing me." "Net," Karen's face tightened. "Yes, but that was before I knew who you were." One of the officers responded immediately. "Ma'am, the law doesn't change depending on who someone is." That sentence hit her like a brick. The crowd around the pumps had grown bigger now. Nothing attracts attention like public drama. People were pretending to pump gas just to watch. Karen clearly noticed. Her eyes darted around nervously, and then she tried her next strategy. "Authority. I'm the president of the HOA in this community," she said again, trying to sound confident. The first officer nodded slowly. "That's nice." Karen blinked. She clearly expected the title to mean something. Instead, the officer continued calmly. "But that has nothing to do with this situation." Another quiet laugh came from the crowd. Karen's composure started cracking. "Look," she said quickly, "I didn't mean to waste anyone's time." The second officer pulled out a small notebook. "Well, You did report harassment and request officers. Karen's eyes widened. You're writing something down? Yes, ma'am. Her voice immediately jumped an octave, but I already said it was a misunderstanding. The officer looked up calmly and were documenting it. Karen's breathing got noticeably faster. Now she looked less like an angry HOA president and more like someone desperately trying to escape a situation that had spiraled out of control. Is that really necessary? She asked nervously. The officer shrugged slightly. When someone calls emergency services, we log the call. Karen rubbed her forehead. This was clearly not how she expected things to go. A few minutes earlier, she thought she was about to get someone arrested. Now she was the one standing there explaining herself. She suddenly turned toward her SUV. Well, if everything's sorted out, I should probably be going. She took a step toward the driver's door. The first officer spoke calmly. Ma'am? Karen froze. Yes? We're not finished yet, and just like that, her plan to intimidate someone with the police had completely collapsed. Now she was stuck standing in front of them, while they started asking very serious questions about the call she had made, and the crowd watching from the gas pumps. They weren't leaving anytime soon, because everyone could tell Karen's meltdown was just getting started. You ever see someone dig themselves into a hole, and instead of stopping, they just keep digging? Because Karen had already made one huge mistake that day, calling the police on the police chief. But what happened next? That mistake started turning into something much worse for her. Karen stood beside her SUV, arms awkwardly hanging at her sides now. Just minutes earlier she had been loud, confident, and completely sure she was about to win this argument. Now she looked like someone who had suddenly realized the ground beneath her feet was collapsing. The officer finished writing a few notes in his small notebook and looked back up. Ma'am, he said calmly, we just need to clarify a few things about the call you made. Karen forced another uncomfortable smile. Of course, but I already explained there was a misunderstanding. The officer nodded slightly. Right, but the call you made reported harassment and requested immediate police response. Karen's eyes flicked nervously toward the small crowd that had gathered near the pumps. People were definitely watching now. Phones were out. A couple customers leaned casually against their cars like they had all the time in the world. Karen clearly hated the attention. Well, yes, she said quickly, but that was before I realized who he was. I crossed my arms and raised an eyebrow slightly. The officer responded immediately, ma'am. Whether someone is the chief or a random citizen doesn't change the nature of the call. Karen's forced smile disappeared. Now she just looked stressed. I didn't mean to waste police resources, she said quietly. The second officer stepped forward slightly. Did he threaten you? Karen blinked. No. Did he touch you or block you from leaving? No. Did he work here and refuse service? Karen hesitated. The gas station clerk cleared his throat behind us. Officer, he told her he didn't work here several times. Karen turned and shot the clerk a furious glare, but again, it was too late. The officer wrote something else down. Karen rubbed her temples like she suddenly had a headache. Look, she said quickly, this whole thing got blown out of proportion. One of the customers watching quietly muttered, Yeah, by you. A couple people chuckled. Karen's face turned bright red. She looked back at the officers again, now sounding more desperate than confident. Can we just end this here? The officer remained calm. We just need to finish documenting the situation. Karen sighed heavily. Her earlier attitude had completely vanished. Now she looked like someone trying to minimize damage. Fine, she muttered. The officer looked at her. Why exactly did you believe he worked here? Karen pointed vaguely in my direction. He was standing near the pumps. One of the customers burst out laughing. Everyone here is standing near the pumps. Even the second officer struggled not to smile. Karen immediately realized that explanation sounded ridiculous. Well, he looked like he knew what he was doing. I couldn't help but chuckle quietly. The first officer finished writing and closed his notebook. "All right," he said calmly. "We'll include this in the report." Karen froze. "The report? Yes, ma'am." Her eyes widened again. "You're filing a report?" The officer nodded. "Whenever someone calls for police response, we log the incident." Karen's shoulders slumped slightly. This was clearly not the outcome she expected when she dialed that number. She had imagined officers arriving, scolding me, maybe even forcing the gas station to cooperate with her demands. Instead, she was the one being questioned. Her story had fallen apart in front of witnesses, and now there was an official record of the entire situation. She looked back at me again, clearly hoping I might somehow help her. "Maybe we can just drop this," she said awkwardly. I shrugged calmly. "You're the one who called the police." A couple people in the crowd nodded. Karen looked like she wanted to disappear. The second officer finally stepped back. "All right, ma'am. You're free to go." Karen immediately reached for her car door. But just before she got in, the officer added one more sentence. "Next time, please make sure an emergency call is actually necessary." Karen froze for a moment. The message was clear. Calling the police because someone wouldn't give you free gas was not exactly a good use of emergency services. Karen climbed into her SUV quickly, clearly eager to escape the situation. The engine started. The car pulled away from the pump. And as she drove out of the station, the small crowd watching slowly began to disperse. A couple customers shook their heads. One guy laughed and said, "That lady picked the worst person to mess with." The officers turned back toward me. "Sorry you had to deal with that, Chief," one of them said. I shrugged lightly. Just another interesting afternoon. But one thing was certain. Karen had shown up expecting special treatment. Instead, she drove away with a story she would probably never want to tell anyone. You know what's funny about situations like this? People who act the most entitled are usually the least prepared when reality finally catches up to them. And by the time Karen drove away from that gas station, she had just learned a lesson she probably won't forget anytime soon. The sound of Karen's SUV faded as she pulled out of the gas station parking lot. For a moment, everything was quiet again. Then the small crowd that had gathered around the pumps slowly started talking. A couple people laughed. One guy shook his head and said, "I can't believe she actually called the police over free gas." Another customer chuckled and added, "And of all people, she called them on the police chief." Even the gas station clerk looked like he was finally able to relax. He stepped out from behind the counter and walked toward us. "Sir," he said to me, still sounding a little nervous, "I'm really sorry you had to deal with that." I waved it off with a small smile. "Not your fault," he laughed, quietly. "That lady comes in here sometimes," he said. But today was a whole new level. One of the officers leaned against the patrol car and chuckled. People get strange ideas about authority sometimes. And honestly, that was probably the best way to describe what had just happened. Karen wasn't really angry about the gas. She was angry because she expected special treatment. She believed that being the HOA president meant businesses had to bend to her demands. And when that didn't happen, she tried to use the police as a tool to intimidate someone. The problem? She accidentally picked the worst possible person to try that on. The second officer looked at me and shook his head with a grin. I wish we could have seen her face when she realized. I laughed. Yeah, that was a moment. And it really was. Because that moment when the officer greeted me with "Good afternoon, Chief," completely changed everything. The confident, demanding HOA president suddenly became someone desperately trying to explain herself. And the situation she created turned into a public embarrassment. The clerk leaned against the counter outside and said something that actually summed it up perfectly. "You know what's funny?" "What?" I asked. "She came here expecting free gas and ended up leaving with a police report." Everyone laughed, but there was actually a bigger lesson hidden inside that moment. Because situations like this happen more often than people realize. Sometimes people believe their title, their position, or their influence gives them the right to treat others badly. They think rules don't apply to them. They think they can bully their way into getting what they want. But reality has a funny way of correcting that kind of thinking. And Karen learned that lesson in front of an entire gas station full of witnesses. The officers eventually headed back to their patrol cars. "Take care, Chief," one of them said before getting in. "You too," I replied. The patrol cars pulled out of the lot, leaving the gas station peaceful again. Customers returned to pumping gas. The clerk went back inside the store, and within a few minutes, everything looked normal again. But I couldn't help thinking about how quickly things had escalated earlier. All of it, over something as simple as refusing to pay for gas. I finished fueling my car and put the nozzle back in the pump. As I got into the driver's seat, the clerk waved from inside the store. I waved back and started the engine. But before I drove away, I glanced once more toward the road where Karen had disappeared, because something told me she was probably going to be a lot more careful the next time she tried pulling a stunt like that. And if there's one thing this whole situation proved, it's this: treat people with respect, because you never really know who you're talking to. The person you're trying to bully might just be the last person you should have messed with. Now I'm curious, if you had been standing at that gas station watching all this happen, what would you have done? Would you have said something to Karen, or just watched the drama unfold like everyone else? Let me know in the comments.